Joining me first is co-founder of The Intercept and host of the podcast Intercepted, Jeremy Scahill. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
Thanks, Ben. And I have to say thank you for all of your great work and the dialogues and discussions you facilitated. I mean, you know, watching your sort of evolution, particularly in such a contentious time that we live, has really been heartening, but also, you know, just deep gratitude to you for the work you're doing.
Thanks, man. And thanks to you and Glenn and the entire team at The Intercept for tapping me to have this conversation with your audience. I really don't take it for granted. So if I started naming names, it would be a disaster. So let's just say the entire Intercept family.
All right, fair enough.
And so let's talk about a couple of things. I had a chance, and let's just jump knee deep into it. And as we jump into it, I want to inform the audience that you can weigh in on the discussion at any time. You can call our voicemail 857-600-0518. You can leave a comment in the comments section and we will try to share it on screen and give you some live feedback. That's a big part of what we do here. And so with that being said, Jeremy, I had the chance to listen to Intercepted last week. And one of the things that I do on my show on a regular basis is against my better judgment, I weigh into the conversation on Syria pretty regularly. And I appreciated your episode because you shared very differing opinions from different voices, and to the point where I was pulling out the little bit of hair that I have left in some regards. And one of the things I appreciated the most about your discussion is that you framed it in a way that I truly identify with, is that, you know, trust but verify is good for citizens, but for journalists, we need to distrust and then verify, because our job is to make sure that the population, that the body politic is informed. Tell me a little bit about your general framework when you discuss Syria.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that we have this culture, particularly on U.S. cable news networks, and they're all guilty of it, some maybe more than others at different times, where I sort of call it sea monkey, analysis, where, you know, you put the little powder into the water and boom, you know, you have like a sea monkey there. It's instant expert, you know, and I think that there's a tremendous lack of people who are directly impacted by particularly wars that are ever allowed onto the airwaves. So you don't hear Iraqis, you don't hear Syrians, you certainly don't hear voices from the Korean Peninsula, from Afghanistan. In fact, many of the people that are talking about these countries and really helping to shape public opinion that will determine the fate of these people, you know, they're generals or they're pundits or they're media personalities. And I think that one of the things you learn, you know, I did war reporting for, you know, the better part of the last 20 years, is that when you enter into either covering a country at war or trying to analyze it, you have to have a base level of humility about it, and you have to go into it with an open mind and with open ears, particularly when you pretend to speak on behalf of people in those countries. Wow. You do that where you're going in and you want to actually listen to what people who are directly impacted by our wars think about them, or their dictatorships or repressive regimes. But also, I think that as Americans, we have a particular responsibility to hold our own government accountable. Right. And so, you know, I give that context because when we're talking about Syria, first of all, I think Syria has become just this murderous killing field, where you have the butcher, Bashar al-Assad, who I believe is a war criminal, and I do believe he has mercilessly, intentionally targeted civilians in an effort to maintain his power. But then you also have the two most powerful military nations in the world, the United States and Russia. On the one hand, Russia is competing with the United States now for major force in the world, killing civilians. They're dropping barrel bombs. They're using, non-precision missiles. They're also giving a lot of the military support that Assad has comes directly from Moscow. The United States and Russia are simultaneously, on paper, fighting the same enemy, which is, you know, what is broadly known as ISIS. But they have very different agendas about what they want to see happen in Syria. And under Barack Obama, there was sort of a flip-flopping that took place on whether or not Assad should be overthrown. And at the end of Obama's time in office, it seemed pretty clear that the Obama policy was that Assad remaining in power was sort of the least bad option. Trump comes into office, and it has this whole sort of brokering of this fake deal with the Russians that, hey, we're both fighting ISIS,
right.
So essentially we're on the same team. And when American troops start to deploy to Syria, one of the things that we've heard from people on the ground is that they actually were positioned between Kurdish fighters
right.
that were trying to go after ISIS, but also against Assad, and then Iranian-backed forces that were fighting on the same side as the United States in Mosul. So what I'm saying here is that you have Russia, the United States, Iran, the Assad government, and then other proxy forces, Hezbollah from Lebanon, and then you have various factions of the Syrian resistance,
right.
Some of which are directly related to or are actually al-Qaeda institutions, and others have a pronounced Islamist philosophy,
right.
but they're not al-Qaeda. And the United States has consistently funded groups that turn out to not exactly be on the same side as the United States. A lot of the focus right now is on this chemical weapons issue and who was responsible for it. And there's a great debate, particularly on the left in this country, but also increasingly on the right, where you have people like Ann Coulter and other right-wing vile individuals, questioning the official story. And I think
right.
what you're referring to was, former Congressman Dennis Kucinich was on our show last week, and I asked him directly if he believed Assad was responsible for the April 4th chemical weapons attack in Idlib province, and he said no. And then I asked him if he believed that Assad had ever used chemical weapons, and he said no, but that it's up for debate. Now, a lot of people could say, "Oh my God, this is a Looney Tunes guy. Isn't he the congressman that was always talking about UFOs?" Dennis Kucinich is a serious person,
right.
And he ran. He was one of the most principled members of Congress, particularly on issues of war and the Patriot Act, and he was consistently right. So I don't just dismiss him out of hand, but I do think that there is this knee-jerk reaction that we see becoming pretty prominent on the left in this country, and it's this enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah.
That if the United States seems to be wanting regime change, then we must be on the side of the regime. And to me, that's a very dangerous road to go down. And if you want to talk about the credibility of the Assad did do the chemical weapons strike and Assad didn't do the chemical weapons strike, I'm happy to tell you my thoughts on that. But I think that it's important to realize that this is a landscape filled with butchers who are doing various degrees of massacring civilians.
So you've said a lot there to unpack, and it's worthwhile. We're getting a lot of questions that we'll ask some of these questions in a moment, but I want to jump in right where you sort of left off. This knee-jerk reaction of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and this willingness on one side of the ledger to demand evidence, which I think anyone who's not demanding evidence is irresponsible. That's number one. But then if you're skeptic on one side of the ledger, how can you turn around and say, almost as a statement of faith, that you don't believe that Assad used chemical weapons at all, like Dennis Kucinich said, or to say that he didn't do this? Like, if you don't have evidence to say that he did it, then you also currently don't have evidence to say that he did not do it. So how do you address that mindset when you're doing interviews like you did with Dennis Kucinich, or when you address people who we otherwise agree with on a lot of issues?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we did on that particular show is we did interview Dennis Kucinich, and I told him straight up that I believe that Assad is a war criminal, and that I wouldn't put it past him to have been responsible or directly ordered this chemical weapons attack. Where I did, and I asked Dennis Kucinich, do you deny that Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal? And he sort of paused and he said, well, no, but they're at war. And the thing is that was the line that's the line that defenders of the U.S. invasion of Iraq use, or the drone program. They say, well, it's war and civilians die. So I reject that across the board, whether we're talking about a dictator or a thug or a tyrant, or whether we're talking about someone who is technically the democratically elected leader of the United States. And I find that moral inconsistency has a place at times, but in general it has no place. And I think that if you're going to be against this kind of mass killing on the part of the United States, which I don't think the U.S. press does enough, pays enough attention to, if we focus, for instance, this chemical weapons attack in Syria, our understanding is that it killed somewhere between 30 and maybe as many as 100 people, and the images were horrifying,
right,
that we saw. But the United States is selling cluster bombs to Saudi Arabia that are killing far more people and shredding them into essentially like ground meat. And Ben, I've seen the aftermath of these kinds of strikes, and so I think it's a moment where we can also say, why is it that we pay this particular attention to this method of killing people when our own bombs are shredding people into meat across the globe? But what we did in response to Dennis Kucinich, and as I said, I think that his credibility as a lawmaker and the fact that he is representing what I think is a fairly significant number, an increasing number of people in this country that believe that there are a lot of lies being told about the Syria war. We brought on Maher Arar, who is a Canadian citizen who was born in Syria, and he's an engineer. And Maher Arar is a particularly interesting guy because he was kidnapped by the CIA at JFK Airport in the early stages of the War on Terror in 2002, and was rendered by the CIA to Syria, where he was then kept in what he called a coffin for 10 months and 10 days, and repeatedly tortured at the direction of the U.S. government by Bashar al-Assad's security forces. And Maher Arar, of course, passionately disagrees with Dennis Kucinich's view on this. He believes that Bashar al-Assad, and that there's no question that he used the chemical weapons. Right. But he also pushed back on the left, on some segments of the left in the United States, and said, I don't want any foreign intervention in Syria. And I'm wondering why you can't find a way to both be against U.S. intervention, but also be honest about who Bashar al-Assad is. And I think that that's probably a position that many Syrians are in, where they don't necessarily want bombs raining down on their country from the United States, but they also are fed up with Bashar. And so, we as journalists can't just race to what we think, what our gut tells us is the right thing, and then proclaim that. I think it's important to have these debates. And I do think there are questions about, particularly the April 4th attack, and whether it was actually munitions that were used, whether Assad ordered it or it was other elements of his military, whether they hit a chemical weapons depot nearby, and the people that were killed got hit with residual sarin. The United Nations just, I believe today, there's a preliminary report that was released that indicates that the forensics say that there were traces of sarin or a sarin-like substance found on the victims of this attack. And I want to see that investigation taken all the way to its logical conclusion. On the other side, look, the CIA has a very long history of misinformation, disinformation, and this term gets thrown around by nutty people sometimes, but it does mean something. False flag operations, where the United States wants it to appear as though Force X did this action, when in reality it was a different faction, and that there's some chess game being played. I'm not by any means saying, oh, that's my conclusion on Syria. I'm saying we have to be really careful in how we analyze this. And if they prove the case against Assad, that should go in the list of charges against him for what I think should be his ultimate prosecution as a war criminal.
Okay, so we have actually quite a few questions from the Facebook chat. And if anyone wants to give a voicemail, you can call 857-600-0518, and we'll play your voicemail on air. There's a question here from Christopher on Facebook. He says, what is your take on the gas attack? It seems like it would make little sense for him to do it, as it would naturally draw the U.S. further in, as it did. It's certainly difficult to discern the truth of the matter. What's your take on that, Jim?
I think that's really an excellent question. And in fact, the director, Oliver Stone, I don't think he's an expert on chemical weapons, but he basically made that point today on Twitter and said, how on earth would this benefit Assad to do this? Ben, it's interesting. I went back, I was reading the writings of Winston Churchill, from the former British Prime Minister, who was lionized for his role as on the side of the Allies in World War II. And Churchill was an early advocate of the use of of what they called gas weapons, the precursor to what we now call chemical weapons.
Right.
And if you read what Churchill said about using them against unruly or uncivilized tribes in North Africa and elsewhere, the point of it was not that it was the most effective way to kill people. It was viewed as a strategically ominous message to send to an enemy of what you could do because of the nature of the weapons. And my colleague Murtaza Hussain at The Intercept sort of made this point last week and said, you know, it's not just about military efficacy here. It also can be part of a psychological campaign. So I wouldn't go so far in the direction of saying, why would Assad do this? You know, it doesn't benefit him. You could look at it from a flip side and say, Assad was concerned that Trump and the United States and Russia were building this alliance in Syria, and that close relationship could result in the Russians and the United States agreeing on a successor for Assad, and Assad basically losing favor with the Russians. So there's a way in which this drove a wedge between the United States and Russia, because Russia says it was a false flag operation. They say the United States is lying. Trump launched 59 cruise missiles and said this was like one of the worst things he's ever seen in his life, which is, I mean, take that for what it is. But I do think that there is a clear way that Assad would benefit from this if his main goal is to maintain power. I will say that there are some provocative dissenters on the other side who are saying, like, this professor emeritus from MIT, Theodore Postal, wrote what I think is a very interesting analysis, and his conclusion is that he doesn't believe that this was a sarin gas attack. But I think, and a lot of people are sort of saying, why isn't The Intercept, agreeing with this conclusion? It's not that we're saying, oh, that guy is wrong. He certainly knows more than I do about it. It's that there are so many people on the other side and people that don't have a political agenda, right, that are saying, no, it's pretty clear that this did happen. So, one of the projects I'm hoping we're going to start working at The Intercept is just to sort of explore the question of, if this was a chemical weapons attack, what would an actual independent investigation look like that could lead to an up or down, yes or no? Were munitions used? Was it a hit of a factory? What exactly happened here? I don't know that we'll ever resolve the issue unless we get dissenters from within the Syrian or Russian military where we would actually understand the command structure for what happened there. But I do think we can do a forensic investigation that would at least definitively conclude whether it was in fact an intentional use of these weapons.
Do you have time for about 2 more questions?
Yeah. Go ahead, but I'm with you, man.
All right, not a problem. And I definitely appreciate it. I have a question here from Eric on Facebook. He said, my question would be for both of us. When is the breaking point to be pushed into war? When should a country like the United States intervene when not to directly involved or threatened? When not directly involved or threatened. I got it that time. What do you think? When should the United States intervene? Where is that threshold for you?
Well, I mean, I don't believe in, cruise missile humanitarianism, the kind that we saw practiced by Bill Clinton for the duration of his presidency. And part of the reason, I'm not some radical libertarian on these issues, but, in every case that I studied, and I speak Serbo-Croatian, I covered the war in Yugoslavia, I understand the political dynamics there. And, the United States narrative then and now remains that Clinton somehow, stopped a genocide in Yugoslavia. And that's just first of all, if that's your only statement on it, it's false. Right. There are times in that war when the actions of Clinton and Madeleine Albright and others actually resulted in escalating deaths in the very places that they said that they were trying to protect the population. Yeah. The Kosovo War, for instance, is one of the most radically misunderstood conflicts, and part of it is because the victors write the history. And the United States, at a time when it was mercilessly punishing the people of Iraq with economic sanctions in the 1990s, was funneling record levels of weapons and munitions to the Turkish government to carry out a sort of almost genocidal campaign against the Kurds, not only in Turkey, but in the countries surrounding it. And I think that the question, which is a great question, presupposes that the United States ever intervenes for purely humanitarian reasons. And I really don't believe that. So I think that almost always when the United States intervenes militarily in the name of humanitarianism, it results in a worsening of the conflict and an escalation. I personally believe that the only wars the United States should ever be in are wars that are truly in the self-defense of people in this country, not corporations, not political authority, and not because your campaign contributors love missiles.
Absolutely. Another question.
What's your answer?
Actually, you're in the hot seat here. I agree. I think they're going to be. This is my stance. Being a non-interventionist is not a foreign policy. I think you can at ebb and flow at times. You can take a step back as a nation and say we need to look internally, we need to take care of things internally, and we don't need to engage in empire building. But there are going to be times throughout world history, we've seen it. There are times that the international community calls on the United States, or even if not the United States, they will call on a global power to have to be involved. And I agree, it should definitely be based on actual national security and not at the bidding of corporations and for the prospect of spreading empire. So that's my quick take on it. But we have one more question.
Can I say one other quick thing about that, though, Ben? What's interesting, if you study what happened in Yugoslavia with Milošević and you look at what happened in 2003 when Saddam Hussein was overthrown during the invasion and occupation, in both of those countries, which I covered extensively, the dissidents that I would talk to on the ground, including people that were dissidents only because they're ordinary people that wanted their government changed, but also political dissidents who really had fought those regimes, some of them said, oh, yes, we want the United States to come in and we want them to overthrow Saddam Hussein, or they wanted them to bring down Slobodan Milošević, but we don't want you to stay and we don't want you to dictate what our government looks like. If you look at what's happened in the former Yugoslavia, you have pro-fascist leaders in power in Croatia. Bosnia is an impoverished state where it's a Muslim country and they're treated like dirt by the rest of the region. And then one of Milošević's top henchmen is in power in Serbia. What was that war all about at the end of the day? It created these ethnically pure parastates, and not with the addition of economic neoliberalism and rising kind of fascistic movements that we're seeing pop up or rejuvenate around Europe. In the case of Saddam Hussein, now, this isn't my position, but I can see a reasonable argument that could have been made to say, let's lop off the head of the dragon, Saddam Hussein, and then you go to the number 2 or number 3, and you say, are you down with the program or not? And I think that that war would have gone in a very different way. But by engaging in what they call de-Baathification and firing, 150,000 Iraqi soldiers overnight in what was a largely secular country, we created. So that's why I say that it's radically oversimplified to say, well, when would you support military intervention? When what kind of atrocity is taking place? There are so many questions to answer before that. Like, is there a diplomatic road?
Right.
What would the world look like if the United States actually supported an international criminal court that would have jurisdiction over every country, including the United States, Britain, Israel, and its allies? Then you could start viewing the handling of despots and thugs and war criminals as a law enforcement activity where you're saying you've been indicted, you're going to be arrested, and if not, an international force is going to come and take you to this court. But it won't work unless the United States agrees to subject its own personnel. Assad is a war criminal. He should be sharing a cell with Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld.
I'm laughing because I agree with you, but to have it put so succinctly is flawless. We have one more comment here. Actually, a few more comments, but this next comment is from Lisa. She said, "What can we do to save a free press so that these important issues can be discussed truthfully? Is it too consolidated?" I'll answer that, yes. And too few corporate owners. How can we stop them from parroting press releases? There has been a lot. The role of the media has been very significant in this, Jeremy. And our ability to, and when I say our, I mean the media, journalists, commentators, our ability to spin a narrative that really can obfuscate the reality of it. So I think this question is very timely. What do you think to her question about the role of media?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think that the overall analysis that she offers is true, as you just validated as well, Ben. You've got a small number of very wealthy individuals or corporations that are in control of a majority of the airwaves that actually belong to the public to disseminate what passes as news programming. And I mean, I think everybody is glad to see the despicable Bill O'Reilly falling. But the reality is that there are a lot of Bill O'Reillys, including at other networks. And if we're talking about misogyny and sexual harassment of women, I think that's probably way more pervasive than anyone ever that wants to talk about, particularly when you're talking about famous, powerful, rich white men at these media outlets and the way they treat the people that work under them. So I'm glad to see O'Reilly fall, but it doesn't really address the fact that Tucker Carlson now is going to be taking over for him. And he has the same basic kind of reprehensible views on the world and dog whistling for, extremist right-wing causes. But on the flip side of it, I think that we're getting a window into what it could be like if we had an aggressive media culture in this country, because Trump is so kind of loathed by so many people, and because he's so cartoonishly kind of bad at his job. I do think you're seeing, the New York Times, the Washington Post, really getting back into the game. And, I don't want to heap too much praise on them, but it is interesting to see Chuck Todd once in a while asking tough questions, because that man wouldn't know a tough question if it came and shaved his goatee off. And all of a sudden now it's like Chuck Todd is Mr. like, we are a free press, and no, you're lying. And, but the thing is, I kind of think of it in the way that we cover school shootings in this country, whether it's at Newtown or we just had the anniversary of the Virginia Tech shooting, the way that those are covered in terms of the victims. The Boston Marathon bombing as well. We knew the names of the dead. We heard the stories of the wounded. Films were made about the way that people rose up and to run in the marathon again. The teachers that threw themselves in front of their students in some of these school shootings. The beautiful drawing that the 8-year-old boy made who was killed in the marathon bombing. And to me, that's real. That's the kind of coverage we should be doing also of the victims of war. Veterans who come back and are committing suicide in record numbers or are walking around with prosthetic limbs. But really digging into how these wars have affected them. And I think that you have these moments in time, whether it's from a horrid tragedy like a school shooting or the presidency of Trump, where you start to see flashes of what it could be like if we actually took our job as journalists seriously. But my fear is that these are just episodic, moments, and that it's not really sticking. And so my answer for Lisa, I think, is I don't necessarily have a magic solution at all, but I do think the means of disseminating information are being democratized because of social media, because of what you and I are doing right now, Ben, because of how you ended up becoming a journalist and a talk show host, that citizen journalists who really take themselves seriously and their role in society seriously can actually make an impact. And that's a very different reality from 20 years ago, from the Vietnam War era, from World War II. We're in a time now where social media can be our worst enemy and our greatest ally. And I think finding a way to combine the old school muckraking with the energized, young, visionary creativity that is exhibited across social media platforms, and a lot of it comes from young people. And you look at the way people respond to the killing of black people in this country by police. This isn't some Al Sharpton-led centralized movement. In fact, it's not just one movement. A lot of times when you really, on a granular level, analyze how did people come to be out in the streets, a lot of it was from citizen journalists, word of mouth, people saying, no, this is the time we have to come out. And that's why I always say to people, like, those of us with getting gray and et cetera, we need to watch what young people are doing, particularly facing down against stormtrooper cops in this country, because they have something to teach all of us. The same is true in media. Legacy news organizations should, and they're starting to catch up to it, and now they're trying to recreate it. It's sort of like the Steve Buscemi meme where it's like, hello, young people. But I think listening is really important for those of us that have been in the game a while. Yeah. Jeremy, listen, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. We so much more that we should and can talk about, and so hopefully we can do it again. Absolutely, my friend. Good seeing you, Ben, and thanks for doing this and all you do.
Hey, my pleasure.